The mahogany door of the main conference room swung open with a soft, expensive hiss. My father, Richard, didn't even look up from his phone. My older brother, Leo, glanced at me, his lip curling into that familiar, condescending smirk. They were sitting at the head of a long, polished table, looking every bit the part of CEO and vice president of Sterling Innovations, the company my father had built from the ground up. I saw the folder on the table with my name on it, my resume peeking out. They thought I was here to beg. They thought they were about to give me a lecture on my life's failures before cruelly showing me the door. They had no idea that this meeting wasn't about my future. It was about ending theirs. They called me here to formally reject my pathetic job application, but what they didn't know was that this meeting wasn't for them to judge me. It was for me to fire them. How does a son end up planning the public destruction of his own father and brother? To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a house where there were two sons, but only one was ever seen as valuable. Leo was the golden child, the heir apparent. He was destined to take over Sterling Innovations. His grades were celebrated, his sports trophies lined the mantelpiece, and his every whim was catered to. I was the other one, the shadow, the scapegoat. I wasn't unintelligent or untalented, but in their eyes, I was simply a resource to be used for Leo's benefit. My job was to be quiet, to not cause trouble, and to make sure Leo had everything he needed to succeed. The ultimate betrayal came when I was 18. For years, my parents had talked about my college fund, a separate account they'd set up for me. It was my one ticket out, my one chance to build a life of my own. The week after my high school graduation, I asked my father about accessing it to pay for my university applications. He sat me down in his study, a place I was rarely invited into. He didn't look me in the eye. He just said, "There's been a change of plans. Leo needed some capital for an important business opportunity, a very promising startup." He told me the money was gone, all of it. He said it was an investment in the family's future, in Leo's future. He told me my best path forward was to find a simple job, maybe get married. "Some people are builders," he said, finally looking at me with cold pity. "And some people are meant to support the builders." They had sacrificed my entire future for Leo's latest whim, and they didn't even have the decency to feel guilty about it. That was the day the son they knew died. A different person began to grow in his place, one who ran on cold fury and a promise I made to myself. One day, I would become the builder, and I would tear their world down to the foundations. I didn't argue or yell. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I simply nodded, went up to my room, and packed a single duffel bag with the few things that were truly mine. As I walked to the front door, my mother stopped me in the hallway. She looked me up and down with disapproval. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice laced with annoyance, not concern. I told her I was leaving. She laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "Don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "You have no money, no prospects. You'll be back in a week, begging Leo for a job. Just save us all the trouble and go unpack." I didn't say a word. I just opened the door and walked out, closing it softly behind me. That was the last time I set foot in that house. The first year was hell. I had a few $100s saved from a part-time job, which evaporated within weeks. I slept on park benches and in homeless shelters. I ate at soup kitchens. I took any job I could find, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, hauling trash. Every bone in my body ached. I was perpetually hungry and exhausted. The worst part was the invisibility. People look through you when you're on the street. I was just another piece of human debris. During this time, I made the mistake of looking at Leo's social media. He had used my college fund to buy a sports car and was posting pictures from a lavish networking trip in Europe. His startup was a complete fabrication. The money meant to be my salvation was funding his vacation. The sight of his smiling face, so carefree and cruel, didn't break me. It forged the anger in my gut into something harder, colder. It became fuel. Every spare moment I had, I spent at the public library. It was warm, and it was free. I had always been good with computers, a skill my family had dismissed as a childish hobby. Using the library's computers, I started teaching myself how to code. I devoured everything I could find on programming, data science, and algorithm development. I worked my menial jobs during the day and studied until the library closed at night, often sleeping just a few hours before my next shift. After a year of this grueling routine, I saved up enough money to buy a cheap, refurbished laptop. This was my first real possession. It wasn't just a machine, it was my weapon, my tool, my path forward. I started taking on tiny freelance coding gigs online for pennies. Most clients were difficult, the pay was abysmal, but it didn't matter. It was a start. It was money I had earned myself. It was the first brick laid in the foundation of the empire I would one day build, an empire they would never see coming. The small freelance jobs were my training ground. I treated every $5 task like a $1 million contract. I was faster, more thorough, and more creative than coders charging 10 times my rate. My reputation began to grow in those niche online forums. Soon, I wasn't just taking the jobs no one else wanted, I was being sought out. The pennies turned into dollars, and the dollars slowly accumulated. After another year, I had enough to rent a tiny windowless room in a shared apartment. It was the first time in 2 years I had a door I could lock. That room became my entire world, my office, my home, my laboratory. I worked relentlessly, fueled by black coffee and the memory of my father's pitying gaze. While working on a data parsing project for a client, I noticed a massive inefficiency in how companies handled large data sets. The existing software was clunky, slow, and expensive. An idea sparked in my mind. For the next 6 months, I barely slept. I used my client work to pay my rent and poured every other waking moment into developing my own solution. A lean, powerful analytics engine that could process information at a fraction of the time and cost. I called my nascent company Nexus Data, and that single piece of software was my first product. I put it on the market with a low, disruptive price, targeting small and medium-sized businesses that were being ignored by the big players. The response was slow at first, then steady, then explosive. My software was doing exactly what I promised. Word of mouth was my only marketing. I reinvested every cent of profit back into the company, refining the engine, adding features, and providing obsessive customer support. I was still a one-man operation, but from the outside, Nexus Data looked like a professional, growing firm. In the background, I'd occasionally hear news about sterling innovations. My father was still running it the old way, relying on reputation and handshakes. They were stagnant, dismissing the tech revolution as a passing fad. They were a dinosaur, and they didn't even know the asteroid was coming. The real turning point came 3 years after I had left home. A mid-sized logistics corporation struggling with their supply chain data took a chance on my software. The results were so dramatic, saving them millions in their first quarter, that they didn't just want to be my client. They wanted to invest. Their first seed funding check was for more money than my father's house was worth. Standing in my tiny room holding that check, I didn't feel elation or joy. I felt a cold, quiet sense of confirmation. The first phase of my plan was complete. Now, the real work could begin. That first check wasn't for celebration, it was ammunition. I didn't buy a fancy car or a luxury apartment. I leased a modest office space and hired my first 2 employees, not from Ivy League schools, but from the same online coding communities where I got my start. They were brilliant, hungry, and overlooked, just like I had been. We shared a singular focus: to make Nexus Data the undisputed leader in our field. For the next 5 years, we worked with a kind of surgical intensity. We launched new products, acquired smaller competitors, and consistently delivered results that seemed impossible to our rivals. Nexus Data grew from a small startup into a global tech powerhouse worth billions. Throughout this entire period, I remained a ghost. The world knew of Nexus Data, but not its founder. I appointed a trusted executive, a man named David Chen, as the CEO and public face of the company. To the media and our clients, I was a reclusive, eccentric founder who preferred to work behind the scenes. To my own employees, I was known only as the architect. My anonymity was my most valuable asset. It allowed me to build my empire in peace, far from the prying eyes of the family who thought I was probably stocking shelves somewhere, if I was even still alive. They never once made the connection. Why would they? The failure they had cast out couldn't possibly be a titan of industry. Meanwhile, Sterling Innovations was crumbling. Just as I had predicted, my father's refusal to adapt had become a death sentence. Their clients were leaving in droves for more agile, data-driven competitors, companies that often used my software. Their profits withered, and they took on massive amounts of debt just to stay afloat. From a distance, I watched their decline with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing a failed experiment. My father, in his pride, blamed everything and everyone but himself. Leo, who had been promoted to executive VP, was even worse. He was a parasite, draining the company's last resources on lavish expenses and ill-conceived vanity projects, all while boasting about the Sterling family legacy. When they were weak enough, I began to move. Through a network of anonymous shell corporations and investment funds, I started buying up their debt from the banks. For pennies on the dollar, I became their primary creditor. Then, I began acquiring their stock, which was now almost worthless. It was a slow, patient process of accumulation. My father and Leo were too busy trying to plug the holes in their sinking ship to notice the shark circling beneath them. After 18 months of strategic acquisitions, my network of companies held 51% of the voting shares and owned nearly 80% of their debt. I owned them. I owned their legacy, their company, their future. The trap was set. All I had to do was decide when and how to spring it. Owning the company wasn't enough. A press release from an anonymous holding company announcing a takeover would be financially devastating for them, but it wouldn't be justice. Justice required a personal touch. It required them to look me in the eye when their world collapsed. I needed to see the moment they realized the scapegoat they had cast out had become their executioner. The plan needed to be cruel, elegant, and perfectly tailored to their arrogance. It had to be a stage play of their own making, with a final act they never saw coming. So, I decided to give them exactly what they wanted, a chance to gloat. I created a new identity for myself on paper, a ghost of the man I might have become had I stayed. I drafted a resume, a masterpiece of mediocrity. It listed my years of dishwashing and janitorial work. I invented a few low-level data entry jobs at companies that had gone bankrupt years ago. I claimed to have a 2-year associate's degree from a community college. It was the perfect portrait of a life of struggle and quiet desperation. It was designed to be just plausible enough to be believed and just pathetic enough to be irresistible to them. I submitted it through the Sterling Innovations online portal for an entry-level analyst position. It took 2 weeks. I imagine the journey my resume took, from an HR screener's slush pile to a manager who recognized the last name, and finally to Leo's desk. I can picture him laughing as he showed my father. The prodigal failure returns, tail between his legs. This was a gift to them, an opportunity to deliver the final crushing lecture on my worthlessness. The call came from Leo himself. His voice was a syrupy blend of fake concern and undisguised glee. "We got your application," he said, trying to sound magnanimous. "Dad and I were impressed with your persistence. Why don't you come into the office on Friday? We can chat about potential opportunities." I knew what that meant. It wasn't an interview, it was a summons. A stage was being set for my humiliation. I accepted with the meekest, most grateful voice I could muster. On the morning of the meeting, I chose my costume carefully. Not one of my tailored Italian suits, but a cheap, off-the-rack one that was just a little too big in the shoulders. I wanted to look like a man trying and failing to appear professional. As I walked into the Sterling Innovations building for the first time in 10 years, I could feel the decay. The carpets were worn, the lighting was dim, and the faces of the employees I passed were etched with anxiety. The arrogance of the men on the top floor had poisoned the entire company. I rode the elevator up to the executive suite, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I reached the mahogany door of the conference room and paused, taking a final, deep breath. The performance was about to begin. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was exactly as I had envisioned. My father, Richard, tapping away on his phone, didn't bother to acknowledge me. Leo offered a tight, superior smile. He gestured vaguely to a lone chair at the far end of the long table, a clear visual statement of my position in their world. I walked the length of the room, my cheap shoes silent on the plush carpet, and sat down. I kept my gaze lowered, my hands clasped in my lap, playing the part of the humbled supplicant. The silence stretched on, a deliberate power play. Finally, Richard sighed, placed his phone face down on the table, and folded his hands. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with warmth, but with a weary condescension. "Well," he began, his voice smooth and paternal, the tone he used for disappointing employees just before firing them. "We received your application. To be honest, we were surprised." He picked up the folder with my resume. "Sterling Innovations has a certain standard, a legacy to uphold. This isn't a family charity." Leo leaned forward, unable to contain his glee. "Let's be real, Dad," he said, snatching the resume. He held it up as if it were a dirty rag. "Look at this. Data entry clerk for Omnicorp. They went out of business in 2018. Then assistant stock manager at a warehouse? Is that just a fancy way of saying you lifted boxes?" He laughed. "And a community college degree. Honestly, I'm almost impressed by the sheer ambition of applying here with this." He tossed the resume back on the table. "Look, out of the goodness of my heart, I could probably get you a spot on the janitorial crew. At least then you'd be in the building." I remained silent. I let their words hang in the air, let them savor their moment of triumph. I watched the smug satisfaction on Leo's face and the cold pity in my father's eyes. They felt powerful, righteous. They were reaffirming their worldview, the one where they were kings and I was a peasant. They were builders, and I was there to support them, even if it was just by being the target of their scorn. Richard delivered the final rehearsed line. He pushed the folder towards me. "I'm sorry," he said with no sorrow in his voice. "There's simply no place for you here. You don't have what it takes. You never did." He paused for effect, leaning back in his chair. "Some people are builders. I told you that a long time ago." That was my cue. The word he had used to shatter my world was now the trigger for the end of his. Slowly, I lifted my head and met his gaze for the first time. A small smile touched my lips. The air in the room instantly changed. For a moment there was only silence. My father's face, usually a mask of controlled authority, had collapsed into a canvas of pure shock. Leo looked back and forth between me and my father, his brain refusing to process what he had just heard. The confident smirk he had worn his entire life was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. "What did you say?" he finally stammered. "I said you're fired," I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Effective immediately. Your key cards have been deactivated. Your corporate accounts have been frozen. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building." I picked up my cheap resume from the table, the one they had mocked just minutes before. I folded it neatly in half. You see, you were right about this piece of paper. It is pathetic. I designed it to be. It was bait, and your arrogance swallowed it whole. You couldn't resist the opportunity to kick the family failure one last time, could you? You can't do this, my father whispered, finding his voice. It was thin, reedy. All the power had been stripped from it. This is my company. I built it. You built it, and you let it rot, I countered, my voice like ice. You became complacent. You relied on your name and your past successes while the world changed around you. You called me a supporter, not a builder. But what have you built in the last decade? A mountain of debt? A company with a worthless stock price? I built a global corporation from nothing while you drove this one into the ground. I stood up, walking around the table until I stood directly behind the CEO's chair, my father's chair. I placed my hands on the back of it. You didn't lose this company this morning, Father. You lost it the day you decided one son's future was disposable. Leo finally snapped out of his trance, his confusion morphing into pure rage. You snake! He yelled, lunging to his feet. You piece of trash! After everything this family did for you! Did for me? I asked, raising an eyebrow. What exactly did you do for me, Leo? Besides spend my college fund on a sports car and a European vacation? I remember that. I remember sleeping in shelters while you posted pictures from your business trip. I remember everything. The door to the conference room opened, and two uniformed security guards stepped inside, their faces impassive. They were my employees now. They looked at me, awaiting their orders. I simply nodded towards my brother and father. Please escort these two gentlemen off the premises, I said calmly. They are no longer employed here. The security guards moved with quiet efficiency. One placed a firm hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo tried to shrug it off, his face purple with rage. Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am? He shrieked. The guard's grip tightened. Yes, sir. You're the former vice president, the guard said, his voice flat. Now, please come with us. Richard remained slumped in his chair, looking 100 years old. He didn't resist, as the second guard gently but firmly helped him to his feet. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading. Please, he mouthed silently. I gave him no response. I just held his gaze until he looked away, defeated. As they were being led to the door, Leo continued to struggle and shout, You'll hear from our lawyers. We'll destroy you for this. With what money, Leo? I asked, my voice cutting through his tantrum. He stopped struggling and stared at me. Every asset you have is tied to this company. Your stock options, your bonuses, your expense accounts. As of this morning, they're all worthless. The credit cards in your wallet will be declined before you reach the lobby. You have nothing. The fight went out of him, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He finally understood. I hadn't just taken his job. I had taken his entire life. Just then, the conference room door burst open again. It was my mother. She must have been waiting in my father's office. Her face was a storm cloud of fury as she took in the scene. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, rushing to my father's side. Then she turned on me. You! How could you do this? To your own family? You ungrateful monster! Ungrateful? I said, taking a step towards her. For the first time, a flicker of my old anger surfaced, but I kept it locked behind a wall of ice. You told me I'd be back in a week, begging for a job. Remember? Well, I'm back. Was I begging? She recoiled, as if struck. You stood by while my future was stripped away and handed to him, I said, gesturing to Leo. You made your choice a long time ago, Mother. This is just the consequence. I turned to the head of security. Please see them all out. This is a private boardroom now. The guards escorted the three of them out into the hallway. Their protests and cries faded as the heavy door clicked shut, leaving me in absolute silence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the city. My city. I didn't feel happiness. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, hollow quiet. The wound they had carved into me could never be truly healed, but the poison had been drained. It was over. I took out my phone and dialed my CEO. "David," I said, "it's done. Release the news, and schedule an all-hands meeting for 2 p.m. It's time the employees met the man who just saved their company." At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I stood backstage, looking out at the anxious faces of the Sterling Innovations employees. They were packed into the company's main auditorium, a space usually reserved for celebrating product launches that hadn't happened in years. They had heard the news of the takeover. They feared the worst: mass layoffs, liquidation. David walked onto the stage first, calming the crowd with his steady presence. He spoke briefly about the acquisition, framing it not as a conquest, but as a partnership. Then he said, "And now it is my distinct honor to introduce you to the man who made it all possible, the founder of Nexus Data, the architect of our future, and the new chairman of this company." I walked out onto the stage to a sea of confused and worried faces. I was no longer in my cheap costume, but in my own clothes. I saw a few gasps of recognition from the older employees who remembered me as the family's phantom son. I stepped up to the podium. "Good afternoon," I began. "My name is Alex Sterling." A murmur went through the crowd. "I know there is a lot of uncertainty right now, so let me be clear. I did not buy this company to strip it for parts. I bought it to rebuild it. For years, this company has suffered from a failure of leadership. That era is over. Effective immediately," I continued, "we will be injecting a massive amount of capital into research and development. We will be integrating Nexus Data's technology into our own product lines to become an industry leader once again. Your jobs are secure. In fact, as a token of my faith in you, every employee will be receiving a $10,000 bonus in their next paycheck." A wave of stunned silence was followed by a burst of spontaneous, relieved applause. "From this day forward," I said, my voice resonating with conviction, "this company will be a meritocracy. Your last name doesn't matter here. Your talent does. Your dedication does. Together, we are going to build something great." As for my family, their fall was as swift as it was total. They lost the house, the cars, and the social status they cherished more than anything. Their friends abandoned them overnight. They tried to sue, but with no funds and no legal ground, they became a laughingstock. My father and mother now live in a small, rented apartment, living off what little is left of their savings. Leo, stripped of the privilege he always took for granted, finally had to get a real job. The last I heard, he was working in a warehouse lifting boxes. I sit now in my father's old office, completely redesigned to be open and full of light. The revenge is a memory, a closed chapter. The hollowness I felt has been replaced by a sense of purpose. I proved them wrong, but more importantly, I proved myself right. I am a builder, not of walls to keep people out, but of a future I designed myself, on my own terms. I am finally free.